This is my first attempt at building a walnut epoxy river coffee table. I'm relatively new to woodworking and I have no experience at all with deep pour epoxies. I should have started filming earlier, as the process of selecting a slab, removing the bark, sealing and building a mould were a big part of the learning process for me. I was in a hurry to finish it for Christmas as a present for my wife, and this led to lesson number 1. Don't leave it too late to select a slab. I took what I could get from my local dealer. The slab I bought was far too narrow and I had no choice but to extend it with some stock black walnut I had to hand. I think what I came up with looks okay, and it might even be mistaken for intentional. The mould was made from 3/4 inch melamine coated with Tyvek tape, links in the description. I probably went overboard with the screws and silicone sealant, but I've seen so many YouTube videos of seasoned woodworkers having to deal with leaks that I reasoned not to leave anything to chance this first time. I was also very careful to level the base using some old adjustable legs for micro adjustment. The precision I used was probably overkill, but it did at least mean I was minimizing both the amount of epoxy I needed to pour and the amount I would have to later remove once cured. The slabs were wedged in place quite well, but as a precaution I clamped them down, helping to reduce the gap underneath that otherwise wastes epoxy. I thoroughly vacuumed before pouring. This would be especially important were I doing a clear pour, but I understand that pigments and sparkly dust are good for hiding dust and bubbles. The pour was the most nerve-wracking part of the process. I used mass deep pour from Rockler, link in the description, with eye candy Pacific blue colorant. I elected to mix by hand, having heard that electric paint mixes can introduce bubbles. Again, the colorant may have hidden any bubbles, but I wasn't going to leave this first one to chance. It was relatively straightforward to swirl in a pleasing pattern, although this led to lessons number 2 and 3. 2 was that the workshop was far too cold, and that drastically increased the curing time. The manufacturer states 77 Fahrenheit, that's 25 C, as a standard operating temperature. In and of itself, this wasn't an issue. The problem was that swirls would sink after a few minutes. Lesson number 3 was to return to swirl it when it had thickened up like peanut butter. Once I realised it was too cold, I whacked up the temperature to 25 C and kept it there for a couple of days. The slab had a hole that passed all the way through that I filled with excess epoxy. This overlapped one of the blocks of wood I used to hold down the slabs, and I was somewhat gratified to see that the block had split open because the epoxy had set so well. At this point I was still concerned that the low temperature might have stalled the curing process, and that helped allay that fear. Mould release was straightforward and the edges neatly peeled off, which was immensely satisfying. The underside also released relatively easily with a chisel. I gave the epoxy glued block of wood a quick planing before hitting with the router sled. This is one of the tools I made for this build that I wish I'd caught on camera. I used 3/4 inch Baltic birch and gave it a 4-foot reach, thinking that I might one day want to build a full-size dining table. My European Erbauer router has been a workhorse, but it does suffer from a dust port that blocks easily. Knowing the mess that the 2-inch flattening bit was going to make, I decided not to even bother attempting dust extraction, expecting that blockages in the router would be more annoying than clean up with a broom. The chips were nice and long and actually not very hard to clean up. With the sealing dust filter on, this process turned out to be much less messy than I'd expected. I made 3 passes per side, 2 about 1 mm deep and the other more like a spring pass. This may not have been necessary, but probably saved some sanding effort. Apologies for mixing units. As a Brit living in the US, I tend to use whatever unit gives the roundest figure. I noticed that passing right to left, that is climb instead of conventional milling, gave a better surface finish and tended not to produce burn marks so readily. I oversized the table a little to allow for some wiggle room and to cut it to size at this point. I knocked down the edges with a little chamfer on the router table, another homemade tool I wish I'd caught on camera, then knocked it down with 60, 80, 120 and 150 grit sandpaper on a random orbital sander. I noticed a few pinpricks that I filled with clear CA glue, filling larger sections with CA mixed with the sparkly powder. This turned out not to match the epoxy very well, both because it's difficult to get the right mix and because the CA didn't dry quite as clear as the epoxy. I don't think this will show, but it does constitute a 4th lesson. I sanded the edges by hand to 220 grit as the scuff lines were still visible at 150. I vacuumed off the dust and cleaned with mineral spirits, as many YouTubers have said that this is a viable substitute for Rubio's raw wood cleaner for use prior to applying Rubio Monocoat 2C. This was a truly exciting step, and I couldn't resist taking some pictures to send to friends now that the finish was really starting to pop. This is, however, something that I'm still not sure about. We can only buy odourless mineral spirits in California, and I found that it took over 3 days to dry and never fully gave up that mineral spirit's oily appearance in places. Perhaps I laid it on too heavily? Next time I'll buy some of Rubio's raw wood cleaner and do a proper side-by-side comparison with mineral spirits. The final step was to mix some Rubio Monocoat 2C Pure in the recommended 3:1 ratio, this being the first time that I've used it. YouTubers often say that it goes much further than they expect, and I think that I overcompensated, having barely mixed up enough for the two sides, even after doubling what you see here with 24 milliliters oil to 8 milliliters of activator. Application was a breeze, and it smells gorgeous, mostly like boiled linseed oil. I used a plastic spreader at first, and just look at how it pops instantly to reveal the grain in the wood and the patterns in the epoxy. I followed it with a white Scotch-Brite pad on the random orbital sander to drive it deep into the grain. I used another piece of white Scotch-Brite to finish the sides by hand, and then left it 5 minutes to soak in, first removing the excess with the other side of the pad, and then finished it off with a clean terry cloth. The surface felt dry to the touch by the time that I had finished wiping. After leaving the first coat to cure for just under a week, I scuffed up the surface using a maroon Scotch-Brite pad on the random orbital sander set to a slower setting. I noticed that parts of the edges and corners on the first coat had a slightly different sheen than the rest, and you can see why here. I had been keeping the sander away from the edges as I was being careful not to round them off. This time I realised my mistake and got closer to the edges, giving a much more uniform finish from this point on. I also don't think I had fully saturated the sides and paid closer attention to them the second time around. Next, a quick wipe off with the tack cloth before mixing up a batch of Rubio Monocoat Plus 2C, this time 30 milliliters of finish to 10 milliliters of accelerator. Once again, here's that glorious moment when the finish pops again. Not so surprisingly, this time the wood didn't absorb as much finish as the first coat. I was now being very careful to buff in all the way to the edges and paid closer attention to the sides. After letting it sit for 5 minutes, I must have wiped off double the excess with the terry cloth than I did last time, but better that than not giving it enough. Again, the surface felt dry to the touch once the finish had been wiped off. The second coat has given the project a slightly deeper sheen that is completely uniform from edge to edge. I'm going to call the top finished, and I'll leave the build of the base for a future video. For now, it will sit atop a $30 IKEA table while I figure out a design. Despite a few mistakes along the way, I am very happy with the result, and I am completely won over on working with Epoxy and Rubio Monocoat. I'm grateful to all the woodworking YouTubers who gave me the inspiration and confidence to try a project like this myself, especially Cam at Blacktail Studio, Mark at The Wood Whisperer, Jim at Stumpy Nubs, and Matt Estlea at Matt Estlea. Is there room for one more? Let me know if you'd like to see more of my work.